College football nerds, we are a day late, but we're still giving you our top 10 for this week. And finally, we are ranking Big Ten teams. Still no Pac 12 because they're not playing yet. Want to remind y'all in the comments, give us your top 10. We love it. We love it. And please like and subscribe. Helps us out a ton. Josh is with me. And, Josh, before we get into this, a lot of people are chastising us for saying, you didn't rank Big Ten teams, and we rank people in preseason polls all the time before they play. The difference is those teams are all not playing. And so what we saw with Penn State Saturday is, you're going to drop some games and lose some games. So it's better to have some actual results than just theoretical, because it's not fair when you're sitting at home not playing anybody and other conferences are taking losses. Okay, we've been going 1 to 10, or last week it was 1 to 4, and we stopped right there. We're going 10 to 1 this time. Josh, I've got Michigan at number 10. I think they're being a little bit punished right now in the rankings because they didn't start high. But they absolutely dismantled what everybody thought was a good Minnesota team coming into the season. I actually had Minnesota winning that game. Apologies to Michigan fans for not believing the hype. So tell me what you think about that and give me your number 10.
I don't have Michigan in my top 10. We are actually at the point now where I can sort of justify not having people in the top 10, in that I feel like the teams in the top 10 are actually reasonably good, which was not true just last week. But I think we may end up doing another video on this, so look out for that, and you can plug in a minute. I think there are, to me, concerns about Michigan and whether there's fool's gold with Minnesota. You're a lot more bullish on them, and we're going to have to sort of dissect that, the positives of the quarterback situation, the negatives, and how much we can or can't take away from that game. I think it's really interesting this season. My number 10 is BYU. First time appearing in either one of our rankings. We've been critical of BYU, critical of the other G5s like Cincinnati. I'll say this, right? And I know you and I diverge a lot. You do not like the fact that they had a 7-point win over Texas San Antonio. I don't like that either, but they have generally stomped everybody else they've played. I mean, 55-3, 48-7, 43-26, 52-14, 45-14. I mean, just bang, bang, bang. And like we talk about it a lot, if you're playing even inferior competition and you're destroying them on a consistent basis, it means a lot. And I'll make the argument here. You talk about them and you talk about Cincinnati. BYU is more explosive than Cincinnati. I don't know that their defense is quite as good, but they don't necessarily look as like there's not a huge gap. And Cincinnati didn't really dominate Army or South Florida themselves. So BYU at number 10, and I think maybe a little bit unduly like being dinged right now, or unduly lowly rated, given the level of dominance they have and the shakiness of other teams.
I can't get there yet. They just don't play anybody. It's just real bad. I mean, the schedule is worse by a significant clip than a 2017 or 2018 Central Florida, and those schedules were terrible. And that's not BYU's fault. But when we've got teams like Michigan and Wisconsin who are going to play teams this year and beat P5 teams on Saturday, as bad as BYU is beating, who did they play Saturday? Help me out.
BYU played Texas State. And, there's a little irony here that I have them up 52-14 over Texas State, and I'm ignoring Michigan playing an actual football team and having something of a similar score.
Yeah, so that was kind of my point. But, it remains to be seen if Michigan's going to be dominant throughout the year. I've got Wisconsin at number 9. I know there's some concerns. Their quarterback got a positive COVID test, and there is a 21-day holdout. I think that Wisconsin could possibly win their next 2 games, and he might be back in time for the Michigan game, having missed a lot of practice, and we saw what Cam Newton looked like when he missed a lot of practice because of COVID. So that's a concern. But in the way we do our rankings, we're not going to look ahead and say you might lose this game, so we're going to ding you. That's not really fair. So I've got them at number 9. Give me your number 9.
My number 9 is Oklahoma State. I think both of us are on the same page with Oklahoma State, especially we were on this page going into last week, and we're very much now there after Iowa State. I think they're a good team. I think it's reasonable to have them in the top 10. I don't have them. I don't think it's reasonable to have them much higher than this. I know they're sixth right now in the AP poll, but they didn't dominate Tulsa. They didn't dominate West Virginia. They certainly didn't dominate Iowa State. I think a lot of teams above them would have the same record they do against the four games they've played. Um, I think they're a good football team. I don't think they're a great one. I think they're going to drop one or two games in the next four, and they'll finish probably be somewhere around a top 15 team.
Yeah, I mean, I don't love the fact that they've really not had a schedule. I feel like they're up there because we're dying to have a Big 12 team that's represented in the top 10. I don't have them in mind at all. I wanted to see them go in the opposite direction. I don't think Iowa State's a terrible team, but we're talking about being ranked in the top 10 and you're beating them 24-21 after you struggled with Tulsa. And I need to see more from a top 10 team. I do have Cincinnati next, and for me, they are a little bit in the same boat as BYU, and I've got them on my radar to possibly drop. I want to see them be super dominant, and they have been dominant for the most part. The thing I like about Cincinnati is that they play defense, and I don't think they have an explosive offense that would keep them in pace with an Alabama or Clemson. But I don't think other teams in the top 10 would score at will on Cincinnati like they would on another G5 or, somebody in that 10 to 20 range P5. So that's who I've got there.
So my number 8 is Florida, and Florida, I think they're almost like weirdly lurking there with one loss to Texas A&M. Them and Texas A&M both. Florida's a good team. There's a lot of concerns with their defense. I've run this statistic a bunch and looked at it different ways now. There is something kind of funny though, where if you look at the triangle with like Florida and Alabama, they've only played the upper echelon teams in the SEC for the most part. I mean, Florida played Ole Miss, they played South Carolina. A game should have been closer, but held them to 24, and they played A&M. But only a handful of teams in the SEC have third down conversions and offensive stats in a high clip. And it's Florida, Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, and I think Georgia is in that group. And Florida playing Ole Miss and A&M, and even South Carolina, which is a middling team in that ranking, I think maybe makes them look worse defensively than they should. And there's this other silo of about 6 or 7 SEC teams that all have actually happened to play each other, like Kentucky and Auburn, that are offensively not being very effective right now. So I think Florida is being kind of dinged early, and I think they're going to prove out, quite possibly with this Missouri game. We'll talk about that maybe later, as being a better team than people are appreciating.
Yeah, and just to plug a couple of our other videos, we did an Ohio State Penn State preview. We are going to talk Florida and Missouri in another preview, and as Josh alluded to, we're going to talk a little bit about what we saw from Michigan against Minnesota. Not a game review, but more of relative to our preview, what we saw from Michigan and how it positions them in the Big Ten. So we're going to talk about that. Florida is next for me for a lot of reasons you just said. I wouldn't be surprised if they beat Georgia. Right now, I still think Georgia is better than them, but I think Florida is good. So I have them there. I'll give you my next one, 2, 10, 9, 8, 7. 6 is Texas A&M, ahead of Florida, but not by much. That game was close, although people say that Texas A&M was lucky to win that game because they came from behind, but statistically they actually were a good bit better than Florida in that game. I think Texas A&M is quietly good and not getting as much credit. Everybody thinks that they're a paper 8 and not a real 8, which is where they are on the AP poll right now. They're 3-1 with a loss to Alabama. There's maybe 1 or 2 teams in the country with Texas A&M's record that would be undefeated, if any. So I don't want to punish him for that. Give me your next.
So I'll go through a few here just to try to catch up. My number 7 team is Wisconsin. Like you said, Wisconsin, just dominated Illinois. I'll say, interestingly, statistically, closer game statistically than Penn State's game against Indiana. That's something we get into a little bit with that. But on the air, totally dominant. Interestingly, in the ground game, wasn't super dominant. But total yardage, 2-1, first downs more than 2-1. Sure. I don't know if Illinois is any good at all, and we're not going to know for a while, and that's the problem in a lot of these games. But I'll give you credit for an absolutely dominant performance. My next team, 6 is Notre Dame. They're just kind of lurking there, and it was the first game where they sort of flashed some offensive capabilities, which was encouraging to see against Pitt. But when you go back and rewatch how it happened, it didn't really happen as a result of high level downfield execution so much as Pitt's incompetence, to be blunt. And there were broken plays defensively, and there were also some like small short plays that got taken for long yardage. And the ground game for Notre Dame was not dominant really at all. 3.7 yards per carry from the leading rusher. Um, so it's hard for me to put them higher. They're still undefeated. I still think they're a really good team, and I think their defense is very, very good. But their offense is not going to really let them get much higher on my list. And I'll do finally. I want to hit my number 5 because it sets up you pretty well, and that's Texas A&M. Everything you said, A&M, we get laughed at for having them like in our top 15 or whatever for years, and saying all we said was they deserved to be ranked over like App State that had a 1-score win over South Carolina. When our justification was A&M dominated South Carolina, and App State beats them by 1 score. We rank App State and not A&M. This year, I don't know if it proves this true, but I think people are begrudgingly saying at least they can't say they're necessarily wrong. A&M, just as soon as they beat Florida and they're not losing to anybody else, it's hard to put them any lower than this. I mean, they're really only the teams in front of them on this list would be capable of having their resume with the same number of win-losses.
And that's why I'll keep coming back every week, is to hear us give you the same spiel about A&M that we do every single week. We've been doing it for a couple of years now. We're not even A&M fans, but we've decided – market research has said that y'all like to hear it, so we keep giving it to you. All right, for me, my next one is Notre Dame. I don't know what to think. Pitt, coming into that game, I think had a very highly ranked run defense. Hadn't been terrible this year. My big criticism of Notre Dame was they struggled with a really bad Florida State team, and 12-7 over Louisville. You can't do that. Like, you got to blow them out of the water. I like that they had a convincing win on Saturday. I think, though, the problem with Notre Dame is a little bit of the problem that we've had with them almost every year. They're deficient at quarterback. They're good on defense, but they're not super explosive and disruptive on defense, which means they're good enough to beat most teams in the country because they're well coached, they're sound, they're fundamental. They're not going to be able to compete with the top couple of teams in the country. A lot of voters dumped Georgia, who's my number 4, after they lost to Alabama, and moved Notre Dame up and kept them up after a struggle win with Florida State and a 12-7 win over Louisville, which this is a rant that I'm going to spare everybody for going too long on, but the only reason Notre Dame had a better win-loss record than Georgia was because they happened to play poorly and had the luxury of playing poorly and winning against Louisville while Georgia was playing Alabama on the road. I can't imagine voting that way, thinking, oh, well, one team's got a clean win-loss record and another one doesn't, so we gotta move one behind the other. That is absolutely ridiculous. Notre Dame would have the same exact record as Georgia, if not worse, with Georgia's schedule, and that's how you got to look at it. Not one team lost and another team didn't. It's if you swap them. If Georgia played Louisville on Saturday, would it be 12-7? No. If Notre Dame played Alabama, would they lose? Yes. So that's that. Give me your number 4.
My number 4 is Georgia, for everything you just said. I think Georgia has a lot of the same issues that Notre Dame has. It's going to be difficult for them to compete with the teams, and you can guess who the top 3 teams are on this list, because these teams, like a lot of elite offenses, and we've talked about this a lot, our channel focuses a lot on the top end of the college football scale. The elite offenses are going to score 40 plus, and you've got to be able to match them. And Georgia couldn't last year in the SEC championship game against LSU. They couldn't this year against Alabama. Just like Notre Dame, they're going to have issues. But I think as much as Georgia's less balanced in offense, I don't know that they're worse. But Georgia is totally elite defensively, and I do think they're the best defense in the country. I know in terms of recruiting rankings, they are by far the most talented recruiting talent defense, and it's not close. So I think they're number 4 in One aside before we move on to the next three. Would you agree with this point? Georgia and Notre Dame are sitting there right behind that crop due to their overall level and what their record would be. But in terms of beating the teams in the top three, I might actually say that Oklahoma, as bad as they've been at times, might have a better chance of beating an Alabama, Clemson, or Ohio State than Notre Dame does right now.
Then Notre Dame, yes, not Georgia. I don't think that Alabama and Oklahoma would be as competitive as Georgia was with Alabama, because Alabama could literally score 70 on Oklahoma if they wanted to. And I know Oklahoma's got an improved defense this year, but I think Alabama's being able to score so much and never having a break offensively would put too much pressure on Oklahoma's offense. But Notre Dame, yeah. I mean, I think Notre Dame could slow down. That's the problem with Alabama. And the point you're getting at, I think it's a good one. Like, without an elite offense, you might be able to keep it closer than other teams with a good defense if you're playing in Alabama or an Ohio State, but you're never going to beat them. With an elite offense and a bad defense, you might have an Ole Miss type game where if Alabama doesn't play perfect offensively, then they lose. And on that, I totally agree.
All right. So what's your top set here?
So I'll give them all three of mine because they're all clumped together. I've got Ohio State 3, Bama 2, and Clemson 1. I really thought about putting Alabama number 1. Clemson was struggling 27-21 with Syracuse in the third quarter. They ended up winning convincingly, but it was not a great game from Trevor Lawrence. And we've seen this in the past. That scared me. That's why I wasn't surprised. You weren't either with his performance against LSU last year. When you consistently have, and not every game, but when you have enough of these games against lesser defenses where it looks ugly, there's something there. There's some there that's concerning. But the problem is Alabama lost Jalen Waddle, and I think if they played today, Clemson would be favored. Because you take that off the board and you see Alabama's defensive struggles. I could see myself putting Ohio State ahead of Alabama at some point if Alabama doesn't play well defensively, but they played pretty well defensively against Tennessee Saturday. 17 points, I think that's what Georgia gave up. And Tennessee was 4 of 16 on third down, which is huge. So Alabama defensively is trending in a much better direction. We called that. Offensively, they're still a beast even without Waddle. They've got a lot of talent at wide receiver. But right now, without Waddle, I think he gives you an element in the special teams game that would kind of shrink the gap defensively where Clemson and Alabama are, and that's why I still have Clemson number 1. Give me all three of your top three.
I have Ohio State 3, Clemson 2, and Alabama 1. So I made the trade that you didn't make. And I mentioned this before the show. We were talking about other things, right? That I'm not ready to ding Alabama yet for the loss of Waddle philosophically. That I want to see the way I'm doing my rankings is how you've done to this point and how you've done against your schedule. And I haven't seen Alabama be negatively affected. In many ways, the Tennessee game was Alabama's best game of the season. Defensively, it certainly was. Like you said, 25% on third down. They went into that game allowing over 50% of their third downs, right? One of the worst, I think, like bottom 10 in college football. And we guessed that was probably actually was a result of playing really all the top offenses in the SEC outside of Florida. Maybe LSU. That's a whole other can of worms we're going to have to deal with because that may be a totally different team by the end of the year than we're looking at right now. But I think they're a complete team. Clemson, they've looked sluggish a couple times this year, and they've done this in the past, and they've turned it around, and when they turn it around, I'll reward them like I have every season. But right now, they haven't done it yet, and right now, I'm being fair. Trevor Lawrence, 6.7 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, was not a good day. They threw 43 passes against Syracuse to win that game, and it was a close game in the third quarter when this Culpepper for Syracuse, who's a bad quarterback, got sacked holding the ball entirely too long, got stripped, and they returned it for a touchdown. And all of a sudden they were down 2 scores, and it just, boom, and all went off the rails. But Clemson right now is almost entirely dependent on ETN and Amari Rodgers. I've seen enough of Clemson in the past couple of years to know ETN is a great back, but teams are able to contain him. Elite teams are, or elite defenses are. And Amari Rodgers is a good receiver, maybe a great receiver. He is not Ross and Higgins. So what they're doing right now offensively is not going to translate, and they've got to find something. And I know that's what they're working on, but they're not there yet. Ohio State at 3 is just kind of by default. They had a great game against Nebraska. The other two teams we're comparing them to have been consistently great. They had their hitches early like everyone has. I'd like to see the run game be a little more consistent, and I'd like to see the defensive statistics be a little better before I move them higher. And that's something I'm going to really be able to reevaluate when they play a real defense in Penn State this week.
And the one thing you said is the thing that concerns me the most about Clemson, that they had to throw 43 times to beat Syracuse Saturday. They didn't have to. Like, they probably could have thrown it 38 times and still beaten Syracuse Saturday. But you don't need that against a bad opponent. That's not a good sign. We talk about canaries in the coal mine all the time on the show, and because we've seen it time and time again throughout the 5 years of doing this show, and obviously being fans before this, that's a concern. And like you, like, I'm willing to adjust my position on Clemson as we go. But look, this is where we are with Clemson because they don't play a lot of great teams. They got Notre Dame coming up, which is a good, not great team. They're going to point to Miami, but Miami was ranked in the top 10 because Miami doesn't play anybody, and we have a weird year this year. The best team left on Miami's schedule is North Carolina. So I'm willing to adjust, and that's the thing that we do on this show is we adjust week to week based on new information. We don't try to justify our previous ranking unless it's Texas A&M based on old data. So I'm okay with that. Anything else in the top 10 before we close it out?
I think it's going to be interesting to see. I could see, like we said, Michigan can climb up, Ohio State could climb up. I'll be curious to see where Wisconsin is. And the other thing I'll say is there are a whole pack of SEC teams that are way down the rankings right now that could actually make this list. LSU, even Auburn, who, like, Auburn is all the way out of the top 25. And yeah, they had a bad loss to South Carolina. These teams all have the opportunity to end up with pretty good records. And LSU in particular, I think LSU is a way more dangerous team than anybody's giving them credit for. And they opened with a disaster, but there's a lot of the season left. There's a lot of weirdness left to go. It's going to be interesting to see who falls in and out of that list, especially the SEC. And I'll say this one last thing. There are going to be a lot of clean records in the Big 12, I think. Like, Kansas State is sitting there at 4-1. Their one loss is really bad, and I am not going to forgive them for that easily. And there are probably going to be some Big 12 teams and maybe some ACC teams, like you're saying, Miami, that are going to have really good records, and they are never going to make this list again.
All right, that is it for whatever week this is. I'll say it on the thumbnail because I don't know. I think it's week 9. That's it for our top 25 or top 10. Give us your top 10 in the comments and let us know where we're crazy. Am I crazy for not ranking Oklahoma State? Is Josh crazy for not ranking Michigan? Let us know. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.